Hey guys, this weekend I was working on ReviseAuth, a gem that I'm working on for authentication in Rails using all the built-in tools. And I ran into a bit of an issue that I wanted to improve, and it required me to dig into the Rails source code to solve it elegantly. So I wanted to show you that process and learn a little bit about how the Rails initializers work internal to Rails so you can understand what's going on and use the same techniques to go build really elegant integrations with libraries you are using. So let's talk about the problem I ran into first. Moses on GitHub had pointed out that if you were to log in with your account on ReviseAuth, what this will do is it will log you in, which is good, but the cookie that is being set by Rails is using the Rails session. And that is a cookie store by default. So it sets the max age or expires after to the session. It basically leaves it blank. And that means that if you close your browser, so we'll close Firefox here, and we'll reopen Firefox, and we'll go log back in, or go back to the page, we're logged out because the browser closing is actually the session. So it resets everything when the browser is closed. So that's our issue. How do we go about fixing it? Well, the first thing I thought about was let's make an initializer. So we can say, let's set the session store and check the cookies for that and see how we do. So this would be like session expires at some sort of initializer name here. And I'm just going to put binding.irb in here. And we can try this out by opening Rails console. It's going to load the engine, load all this stuff, and hit our initializer. So our Rails application config has a session store, and oddly, that's nil. And that was one of the troubles I was running into. When does the session store get set? Because Rails will use the cookie store by default, but clearly at the time of running the initializer, it's not set yet. Now, the other thing that Rails will set when you assign a session store is the options. So the first argument will be the session store, so like the cookie store, Redis store, Active Record store, whatever. But then the rest of the options are actually saved under session options. So this didn't work. And I went back to the drawing board and I was like, well, what about after initialize? So we'll try that, run the Rails console. And this is what? Config.after initialize? I forget. Given 1, expected 0. Yeah, so we don't need the string here, but we did get the right method. So here we go. We get this Rails application session store. Aha, cookie store. Great. So the session options are set to the key that's auto-generated and the cookie only auto-generated by Rails. Only thing I want to do here is say with defaults expire after 30.days. So I want to make that change. Seems great, okay? So run this and restart our Rails server. And actually we want to say rails.application.config session options with defaults expire after 30.days. So that's the change that we want to make to the Rails initializer, right? So that sounds good. So let's close all this out, restart our Rails server, and let's log back in once this is ready. So we'll log in, put our email address in, password 1234, never save, and this is good, but let's look at our cookie. It still says session. So what is going on here? We change this and something is not right. So it saves it, we think. And one way we can check is let's open the Rails console and we can say, after everything's loaded, did that get set? And did it save it permanently? And it seems to. We get expire after here, and that's good, but what is actually going on? So this is where I ended up going into the Rails repository, trying to look for like, what is this cookie store and where is it and how do I find this stuff? And so I look for a cookie store in here, and we see, where it's defined, abstract secure store. But what we're looking for is like, use action dispatch session cookie store. So it's a middleware. Now, if you just look at this on its own, you might not realize it's a middleware. Because you look at this, there's no like call method or whatever, but maybe under abstract secure store there is. But also, here's where you'd realize it's under the middleware folder. So we can kind of now understand this is probably a rack middleware. And it requires this rack session cookie. So maybe the actual implementation is not inside Rails itself. So I got poking around and I found rack session. And then I saw, this is rack session cookie, and there's our expire after. So chances are Rails is generating the config for and a little wrapper around this rack session cookie. And that's what we need to figure out. Where can we inject into that default thing? But this also gives us some information. And we can look at this abstract store and whatever. So here's our session store. Yada, 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 abstract store, set cookie. So you can kind of understand, like, it's setting cookies here. And we can assume that, it's a rack middleware of some sort, but can't really maybe find a good place, like, where is that stuff happening? Like, we need to figure out what are the options, because this is setting a cookie, but, like, where does it set the expire after and those options? So I got looking at, like, what about that session cookie from rack? What if we look around for that? There's some tests for sure. There's this. This didn't have a lot of information. There's some more tests, more tests, more tests, more tests. Action dispatch, cookie store, references that. But again, tests, guides. Here's another one that talks about cookies used by Action Dispatch, cookie store. And I poked through some of this stuff and I was like, yeah, but this stuff, the code that we wrote should have worked because we're changing that variable and you would think it would actually get changed. And then I realized, what's happening? Rails has middleware. So when you run Rails middleware, there's an entire stack of middleware. Let's see, Rails-T. I thought it was the middleware command. Not in our. So we got to go into test dummy where our Rails app actually lives. Rails middleware. That's the command I want. And it will print out all of the middlewares that your Rails application uses. And here we can see the cookie store. Action dispatch session cookie store. So what I'm wondering is that middleware being instantiated with the options, and by the time that it gets set here, these options have already been used to create the middleware stack, and that was where I went to next. So I started to look and see, like, where's the middleware stack? I searched something like this, and I was like, how does this stuff get created? And I know that Rails has some middleware documentation and things, but just poking around the code and things, you start to see some of these references and, find like Railties is loading things, and there's somewhere in here that is going to define the middleware stack. Here's stuff on the engine. That's interesting. So middleware.use, that just adds it to the middleware stack. But somewhere it is going to be messing with that session store. So I started looking back to the session store again, searching for that, and trying to figure out where is that defined and where is it used. So this Rails application configuration object was pretty important because this is where the session options and session store are defined. So if we look for session options here, we'll see this method where you assign session options or the session store, which will take the options. And then if you've got a new one you're assigning, it will assign those two variables. That's all it does. Nothing fancy. It will retrieve it though, where you have set it. And then I was like, yeah, but where does that get used? So I start looking around again and I notice, here we go. Default middleware stack says, if it's not API only and there is a session store, middleware use the config session store, and here are the options that we pass into it. So there we go. I figured out this is where it's actually being added. And this is an interesting file, this default middleware stack called build stack at some point. So we are trying to insert this at the right time before build stack runs. So that is where this defines the middlewares. And actually, this is cool. Yeah, I realized like, oh, so host authorization gets added there. Assume SSL. Never heard of that one. Might be interesting to read into. Force SSL. This is a really good one that I use all the time. And turns out it's just a middleware too. And you start to see all of these and realize like Rails is compiled of all these features, but a lot of them are just simple rack middlewares for doing things like forcing SSL. And we can easily find the code and the documentation and figure out how these work by just poking around and finding the right files in Rails. So if you search around, you're going to find some cool stuff like this default middleware stack. So I looked in this application folder and I was like, oh, that's where the configuration is, the middleware stack, bootstrap.rb. Like, this is all pretty cool stuff. But still, I don't know where that session store is being referenced. So I kept looking through some of these things, not finding much of anything. Config, session store, guides. And then I found this finisher.rb. And this sounds pretty interesting. So there's a Rails initializer called setup default session store before it builds the middleware stack. And it says if there is no session store, let's find your app name or figure it out and set the key to your app name session and tell it to use the cookie store. And then that runs right before this build middleware stack, which, of course, builds that middleware that adds the cookie store. Oh, this must be it. So I found the initializer that I'm looking for. And now I know I could just take the same approach here and modify our code and say, why don't we say set default expire after, or default session expire after might be the best. Session cookie might be even more accurate. And then I could just use the same approach they did. In fact, I haven't hardly seen any examples Googling where there's before and afters. And I've definitely never seen this setup default session store initializer. And here we have our app, and we can then say app.config session options with defaults, just like they're setting the session store here. One thing we probably want to do, though, is we're going to say if app.config.session store is equal to the what was it? The cookie store. Let's go look that up again. Cookie store. Action dispatch action dispatch session cookie store is the class name. So we want that. Action dispatch session cookie store. So if the user had set up a session store for like, maybe they had used Redis or Active Record or whatever, we might not want to modify that and set the expire after automatically. But we might for those as well. Something to figure out. Like the Redis and Active Record and other session stores that store in a different place than cookies in the browser, they still need a cookie in the browser to set the session ID. They're not storing the entire data in the cookie. They're just storing a ID in the cookie. So we might actually want this for all things, but we can first, for now, while we're figuring this out, only apply it to the cookie store to be safe. And this was, I believe, my final solution. So we'll restart our Rails server and we'll try this out again. So we will now be logged in. We can close, or actually let's log out, log back in. So we want to create a new session. 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll log in. And we now see that our expires at is setting the time correctly. So the expires or max age is actually correct. So what we ended up doing was some really crafty, look into the Rails source code to really just poke around, like, we're calling this method. So what does that method do? It's setting these variables. What other pieces of code are using those variables in Rails? And you can work through the Rails source code and start to understand pieces of it, even though you may not understand the entire boot process. You can learn a lot. And we ended up in finisher.rb, which is where it runs all of these different initializers that run to finish preparing your Rails app. So here's where eager load runs. Here's your prepare callbacks. So you can register those and then they get executed here. And there's all kinds of other interesting things happening. You can see that they use initializers to say, hey, those after initialized callbacks that we defined or looked at earlier, that's where they come from, right here. Active support, run, load hooks, were after initialize. So there's all kinds of interesting things that you can find in Rails. You can find right here the internal route. So if you've ever wondered where those Rails routes or the welcome Rails route is, it's an initializer and it just says, hey, if we're in development, we're going to add these routes. We're going to add this. If there is no root route, we will end up rendering that. So this is it. This is where all kinds of cool stuff happens in Rails that define things that only run in development for cookie or for sessions, for initializers, eager loading, you name it. All kinds of interesting things here. And I just wanted to share this process with you because when Rails does this thing and it sets a cookie store, you can actually go and figure out how that works and then make a really clean integration that now, if we want to just keep the session options and always include that expire after, there we go. That's it. One-liner. We just needed to know where to plug in our initializer into that process. So this is what we ended up doing. We may change this so that if you're using the Redis store or whatever, it can keep that cookie around for longer. I haven't actually tested any of those yet, so we just left it at cookie store. But it's really interesting to solve these problems because you could definitely hack your way around and, replace or do your own cookie management yourself and kind of ignore the session in Rails and replace that. But we want to stick with the way Rails does things. We want it to work as it would be expected to. We don't have to do workarounds. And so reading and understanding how Rails works really helps you solve problems in a better way. So I think a lot of people end up doing those workarounds and then it becomes unmanageable and very hard to maintain. But if you're willing to learn some of how the internals of Rails works, you can save yourself an awful lot of trouble and you can really become a better Rails developer or Ruby developer for that matter, because this is really all Ruby code and it just happens to be the way the Rails framework loads. But you can apply this to any gem, any library, any framework in Ruby and do the same thing because it's all the source code's available to you. So that's it for this episode. I just thought it was something really interesting. I didn't know hardly anything about the Rails initialization process until I started poking into this stuff. I didn't know about how does the session store get assigned and where does that go? I had no idea it was a rack middleware, but of course it's a rack middleware. That makes a lot of sense. And so these things became now first party knowledge to me. So going and building other libraries, building other Rails apps, I can apply this knowledge and save myself tons of time, lots of hours, because I can just go find the answer right away now. So I just wanted to share this because I found it really useful. I figured you might also find it really useful and wanted to help share some of that secret knowledge that makes some people magically faster than you at Rails, because They just know where to look, and you can figure it out too. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to see more stuff like this, let us know in the comments below. And we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.